Okay, so it's now a minute after 1, so I think we're good to go ahead and get started. So hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 2022 HAP Mini Symposium. I'm glad so many people were able to make it to our virtual event. We're all excited to have the opportunity to host it. So I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Alina McCullough. I'm a member of Chapleau Cree First Nation, also of mixed European ancestry, and raised in North Bay, Ontario, which is where I'm joining you from today on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe. I'm currently a master's student in environmental science at the University of Guelph, and prior to that, I was a biologist intern with Wakatoan Development, and I'm continuing to work with Wakatoan as the partner organization on my research. So before we get into the agenda, I'll just go over some brief housekeeping items. So first of all, please keep your microphone off unless you wish to participate in the discussion or you have a question. If you wish to do so, please raise your hand and I will invite you to unmute yourself at the appropriate time. So please have your mic off, but you're welcome to have your camera on. In fact, you're encouraged to have your camera on so that we can see all your faces. And second, there will be a brief question period after each of the 5 stories that we'll be sharing today. If you have a question, you can either, again, raise your hand and wait to be called on, or you can enter it in the chat box, and that way we'll see it and we'll be able to come back to it later, or if we don't have time, we'll be able to follow up on it after today's session. And lastly, as you probably all saw, the session is being recorded today. So first, I will invite HAP core team member Nelson Tifo to start us off with an acknowledgement.
Thank you very much, Alina. So, bonjour, bienvenue.
We can't hear you, Nelson.
Oh, sorry. Now, is that good? No? Yes?
Oh, that's me.
Okay. Okay, so bonjour, bienvenue, welcome. I'm Nelson. I'm a research scientist with Natural Resources Canada, and thank you for joining the Herbicide Alternative Program 2.0 mini symposium today. So I'm joining you from Quebec City, the Wendake Neo-Wenstio traditional territory of First Nations, including the Huron-Wendat people. Quebec is a city and region with a history that extends back over thousands of years, with its first inhabitants being First Nations people. And on this project, it has been a pleasure to work with colleagues and communities in Ontario within the Robinson, Superior, and Treaty 9 territories, from Lake Superior to the Quebec border and spanning the traditional territories of Ojibwe, Chippewa, Ojibwe, Muskegowuk, Anishinaabe, and Algonquin peoples. As we gather virtually today from across Ontario and beyond, I asked my non-Indigenous colleagues, please to reflect for a moment about the traditional land on which you are joining us today. And to help you with that, you can click the link I just pasted in the chat and have a look. And I'll leave you a few seconds to do that. I also want to remind you all that today, May 5th, is National Day for Awareness of Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, also known as the Red Dress Day. So please take a moment to think about the numerous Indigenous women, girls, and other people lost to violence in Canada. And to guide us in this mini forum, I would like to welcome Alina from the Chapleau Cree First Nation. And in honoring your tradition, Alina, and in the spirit of reconciliation, on behalf of all the organizers, we offer you a virtual gift of tobacco in appreciation for your role today. Thank you. Miigwech.
Merci, Miigwech, Nelson. Thank you so much for that acknowledgement. So next on our agenda, I will be inviting HAP core team member Chris McDonald to give us some background on HAP and how we got to the stories that we'll be sharing today.
Thank you, Elena, and thank you, Nelson, for opening us this afternoon. I'm Chris McDonald. I'm a forester with Green First Forest Products, formerly Rayonier Advanced Materials, formerly Tembec. I'm joining you today from the traditional territory of Nipissing First Nation on the south shore of Lake Nipissing. And I'm so pleased that we have such a broad audience that's joining us for this mini symposium here today. For about 10 years or so, there has been a sustained effort to regenerate forests in the Northeast Superior region without the use of herbicides. This is such an important priority and focus, and renewal of the forest so important to all of us for wildlife habitat, for traditional medicines, for so many uses of the land, including wood products, can be done without the use of herbicides as we set our mind to do that. As a group which has evolved and had many participants over the years, we've been to Quebec to learn about their approach. We've had discussions and benefited from the knowledge of Indigenous elders, leaders, practitioners, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, from forest managers. We've reviewed forestry practices and introduced new approaches. In 2016, our efforts received a substantial boost through the leadership and support of the Wakatoan Development, a First Nation business owned by Missinaba Cree, Brunswick House, and Chapleau Cree First Nations, where the chiefs of those communities and the chiefs as with the chiefs of other communities in Northeastern Ontario, strongly and emphatically urge us to move forward to find alternatives to the use of herbicides. Through the support and collaboration of Wakatoan, we introduced vegetation surveys undertaken by Wakatoan staff and guardians, leading to substantial reductions. Lands and resources staff of First Nation communities play a leading role in identifying areas to be prioritized for alternative regeneration approaches. We've experimented with larger seedlings. We've upgraded our planting stock. We have a lot more work to do in this regard as we continue to provide more tools for our forest managers to take decisions, to understand the forest in advance of forest management and harvesting, and to apply non-herbicide approaches. In 2018, we again collectively saw the need to do more, to broaden our approach, to seek additional sources of information and expertise in pursuit of the objective. And so back in the fall of 2018, and fueled by, if I recall, 10 extra large pizzas prepared in the ovens of the Trois Moulins Hotel in Chapleau, Ontario, the idea of HAP 2.0 emerged. And so we're grateful for the expertise of scientists and practitioners from Natural Resources Canada, Canadian Wood Fiber Centre, who joined with Wakatoan, with forest managers in the Northeast, and ongoing support of collaborators with the Ontario Forest Research Institute, with CINFER, and Northeast region of NDMNRF. This summer, more Indigenous youth than ever will be present in the Chapleau area, with Wakatoan Guardians and with the Ontario Youth Employment Program camp at Missinaba. We look forward to the promise of a year where brushing and continued vegetation surveys continue, and where forest brushing, as mentioned, gains a foothold as a common non-herbicide option in the forest. We are on the threshold of receiving LIDAR, new forest inventory data, and that information, supported by an ecological framework connected with soils information, will assist forest managers in identifying non-herbicide approaches prior to timber harvesting. And we see that over the next year or two. Mycorrhizal treatments, which you'll hear about later, of seedlings will begin next year. Thanks to Elena, to Isabel Allen, to David, to Nelson, and to Guy Smith and others who have worked with all of us on this journey. We have a ways to go. There's been tremendous success to date, and we look forward to the stories and the ideas that emerge from this session here this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for providing that background. So I will just share the agenda for the rest of our session today with all of you. So we have 5 stories that we're going to go through, followed by a quick 15-minute break. And then the second half of our session today will be a panel conversation about what's coming at us in the near future. So we have roughly 20 minutes for each story, which includes about 5 minutes for questions and answers. If you have a question, again, please raise your hand or type it in the chat, and we will answer as many as we can within the time that we have after each story. If you have more questions for any of the individuals today that we don't have time to address, we will do our best to follow up after the symposium today. So again, putting those in the chat will give us an opportunity to keep track of questions. And our first story today comes from Amberly Kwakajizik. Amberly is the Guardian Program Manager at Wakatoan. She is from Shaklo, Ontario, and is a member of Brunswick House First Nation. She holds a teacher's degree from Nipissing University and is passionate about youth and social development. So I'll pass it over to Amberly to start us off with our first story.
Thank you for that introduction. As you mentioned, my name is Amberly Kwakajizik. Isabel couldn't be here today, but we did create this presentation together, so I will be reading her speaker notes on her behalf. So yeah, the boots on the ground, the Guardian story. Next slide, please. Thanks. HAP 2.0. So HAP arose from advocacy of First Nation communities bringing their concerns about herbicides to Tembec. Green First Forest Products, formerly Rainier Advanced Materials, formerly Tembec, recognizes that they source 100% of their raw materials from land that they do not own. They desire to reach an agreement with Indigenous communities aligning with free, prior, and informed consent in order to maintain relationships. As useful as herbicides may or may not be, the goal of the forest industry is to develop and regenerate forests in the best way possible, with scientific, economic, and socially responsible practices. HAP 1.0 resulted in a 75% reduction in active ingredient applied in the Shapleau Crown Game Preserve between 2007 and 2017. After this initial success, there continued to be a shared desire to move towards more on-the-ground activity and to create a HAP toolkit that would support forest managers and silvicultural personnel. Wakatoan joined the HAP initiative in 2016, and we now engage with Natural Resources Canada, OFRI, and MNRF Science personnel to advance the program. A foundational principle of HAP 2.0 is engagement with Indigenous people to encourage connections among Indigenous knowledge, ecological research, and advanced technology. The Northeast Superior Guardians Program. So the program originated from the elders of the Northeast Superior region. They asserted that for Indigenous communities to meaningfully participate in forestry operations taking place in their territories, a youth-centered stewardship strategy had to become a top priority. What was heard from the elders was a need for stronger Indigenous roles in land use planning, management, and decision-making. It was also important for elders that community youth reaffirm their connection to the land through traditional practices and ceremony. So we are now building this program using the elders' vision and being guided by 13 Moons calendars to offer land-based programming that empowers youth from our First Nation communities to build relationships to their homelands, culture, and original ways of knowing, all while developing skills, gaining experience, and exposure in the natural resources sector. So this last summer of 2021, we had 5 Guardians on the team. They received a wide range of training throughout the summer. On the slide I listed, that might be the old slide. Okay, that's okay. Some of the training that they received includes bear-wise training, vegetation index training as well, species ID, compass, GPS, orienteering, first aid. They did a lot of field training as well to prepare for this project. 3 of them were in high school. 1 lead had just graduated from the Natural Environment Tech program, and 1 lead is studying to be a teacher. For some, it was their first job, so there was a lot to gain. The Veg Index Veg Index project was great for getting to put these new skills to use and giving them exposure to the world of forestry practices. It didn't take long for them to catch on. You could see the confidence growing day by day as they grew more comfortable with these skills and with their new teammates and the bonding that was being created throughout the summer. So by the end, they had a lot of questions. They were having some great discussions. I remember hearing them talking about like who designed this app and did this person ever use it? And maybe it would be better if it was in alphabetical order. And like they just had all these opinions and it was great. So we started writing their questions down and thought it would be a good idea to reach out to Chris McDonald about having this conversation so that these questions could be answered, because they really became quite fully invested in the work that they were doing and they wanted to know exactly the kind of impact that they were having. So of course, Chris was down to meet. We created this space and they had a discussion and they were encouraged to share their feedback with the company. They wrote down suggestions and thoughts, and it was a really empowering experience to see all these youth wanting their voices to be heard and then participating in that discussion afterwards. And then one of the quotes, I used to just see green bushes. Now I know what, yeah, now I know what their names are. It's so true. They really caught on, and it was just really nice to see in such a short period of time. It seemed so daunting at first, but yeah, it was great. Thanks, Alina. So vegetation index surveys, the surveys themselves. Here's a photo of the Guardians receiving training from Dania Yut, and I came out to help support this because I've been doing them myself for the past 3 to 4 years. So a quick version of how to do a survey using the maps provided by RIAM at the time. They indicated where to conduct each survey. We would walk out to the first plot, find the nearest planted tree, record the species name and height, and then we would use a tape measure to record the average height and abundance of each species within a 1.3 meter radius of the planted tree. Once all the info was entered into the competition index app, which was provided on a tablet, a number was produced, therefore indicating whether or not that area required spray. So then we followed the map to do the next 4 surveys in the line and continue to do those surveys that way. Herbicide net down. So these images show the results of the vegetation index surveys. The image on the left shows the blocks that are planned to be sprayed, outlined in the yellowish orange color. Each dot represents a planted seedling that was measured and had the surrounding competing vegetation measured to generate a competition index value. A competition index value over 60, shown as red dots in the image, means that the area may need to be sprayed due to a large amount of competing vegetation. The green dots show a competition index value of less than 20, meaning there is very little competition and the seedling will likely be able to grow to a healthy maturity without being assisted by herbicide application. The image on the right shows the netted down version. You can see that due to the low competition index values, the majority of the blocks were dropped from the spray program. This tool is used to reduce the overall volume of herbicide being applied to the forest in accordance with HAP goals. Brushing plots. The brushing plots were established to evaluate the ability of the vegetation index to predict planted seedling responses in height and diameter growth to release over a gradient of site conditions. This work occurred in late summer of 2020 in RIAM's Harvest Block 405, located near Brunswick House First Nation. A total of 30 paired plots were completed with 543 individual seedlings measured and recorded. These plots will continue to be monitored and measured by Guardians in years to come. Benefits. The benefits of completing the vegetation index surveys and brushing plots and participating in HAP initiatives in general are to raise the awareness of forestry practices in the area by getting youth out on the land to see with their own eyes what is going on, increasing youth capacity. At the end of field season, the youth will gain experience in orienteering, using GPS, plant ID, and increase their overall level of comfort of just being in the bush. The complementary benefit is that while all of this is happening, we're also directly impacting the volume of herbicide being applied to our community's territories. So next steps, we'll be continuing to do the veg index surveys, as well as a variety of other fieldwork projects, such as we're planning a site tour with Green First Forest products and a tree plant day to gain exposure. Revisiting our HAP brushing plots that we did a couple of years ago, and working with MNRF to expose youth to different types of forest practices and forest management strategies, trying to make like a sequence of learning and trying to incorporate elders and so the two-eyed seeing. So, and another one is moose monitoring and pellet plots and the mycorrhizal inoculation. Just a lot of great things on the go. And lastly, the reflection. So the Guardians came out of this program a lot more confident and a lot more aware of the types of activities that were taking place in the forest. They were curious to grow their knowledge of the forest and eager to make an impact. They further developed their connection to Mother Earth and now have a better understanding of the types of careers that do exist in conservation and in the forestry sector as well. And I think anyone who comes out of this program will come out seeing the forest differently, which is something we strive to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Amberly. I am super excited for this summer's Guardian program. So we do have time for questions. I see there's one in the chat. This sounds like a great program for the high school students. Is there an opportunity to earn credits?
We're looking into that. It's not just yet, since we're so brand new. This is like our second summer having youth on board, but that is definitely something we're aiming to lean towards in the future.
Hi, Amberly, it's Lisa. That was a lot to take in, a very good presentation. I'm wondering if I can get your notes.
Yeah,
on that.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Great. Any other questions for Amberly? Okay. Well, thanks again, Amberly. I guess oh, yes. There's another question in the chat. Thank you for the good work that has been going on. I wonder if there are learnings from other regions of Ontario.
Yes, like there are Guardian programs like all throughout Canada, but they're all different and very specific to the region in which they exist. And so there won't be another one exactly like this, that's for sure. But yeah, there are opportunities, and if there's a Guardians toolkit, you can visit online and it can show the different types of Guardian programs. We're on there actually, and it can give a little blurb on what they're up to.
Elena, it's Chris here. I see James has his hand up, physically has his hand up on screen. So just to note that, and also I noted that individuals are asking about the speaker's notes and contact information, and certainly information can be shared in that regard after the presentation with all the participants. So
yes, definitely do that.
But I don't see James's last name, but perhaps James wanted to speak.
The question I have after the veg index and those surveys and where there were locations with a high number, was it a ground application or was it aerial?
I'll answer that. It was an aerial application, James. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. So I think now we can move on to our second story of the afternoon, which is going to be presented to us by Isabel Soulier. Isabel is from Missinaibi Cree First Nation. She's a mother of 5 children and a grandmother of 4 grandchildren. She is currently working for Natural Resources Canada and was recently the Community Indigenous Liaison for the Canadian Fibre Centre as the lead for community engagement through the HAP 2.0 webinar and roundtable series. She has also sat at the Mushkegowuk Environmental Resource Center table in 2010 for the first HAP project, appointed by the late Elder Archie Nolan as the technical advisor. She holds a fish and wildlife technician diploma and degree in fine arts, and served one term as a counselor for Missinaba Cree First Nation from 2013 to 2016, and was the environmental steward with Mushkegowuk Council for MCFN. She has spent most of her time learning the plants on the land and is dedicated to learning more each day and respects the ancestral knowledge that she has gained from being on the land each day. So I will pass it to Isabel to tell our next story.
Hello, everyone watching. Connie, thank you, Elena, for the introduction and for inviting me to present my story on the HAP 2.0 webinar and roundtable series. And as the lead and host of the series that went over the course of 2 years, I hope you enjoy the presentation. As an Indigenous and community liaison for Natural Resources Canada with the Canadian Fibre Centre, my focus was generally on community engagement. So my audience for the webinars were key representatives from the First Nation communities, Natural Resources Canada, and the Ministry of Northern Development, Mines, Natural Resources, and Forestry. In February 2020, it was the beginning stages of my employment, which was also the COVID restrictions were being implemented during that time as well. So I was only placed at the GLFC for around a couple of weeks, and I was in the process of setting up remotely to work in my traditional territory in Missinaba. So in light of this pandemic, we chose to create a webinar series to keep things moving forward with the HAP 2.0 action plan and with the engagement process. Before I get into the history, I'll give you a little bit more background information of my involvement in the early stages of HAP of 2010, 11, I think it was. As mentioned in the intro, I had the opportunity to sit at the table with Gordon Kayahara, who was influential in the previous herbicide alternative project. And in 2013, he wrote a paper called Understanding the First Nation Rights and Perspectives on the Use of Herbicides in Forestry, a case study from Northeastern Ontario with Carly Armstrong. In that paper, I provided my own experience and perspective of how I was being impacted by the application of chemical herbicides in our territory. And I gave a story on how my family was impacted culturally, socially, and how our health was being impacted by not being able to pick in many of the areas we used to pick. Our Indigenous knowledge was being lost due to the lack of original medicines. So I gave my perspective through an actual story that happened when I tried to take my family to collect berries and we could not find a place that was not sprayed. Next slide. Okay. So looking at the history of when it was first brought forward, in 2010, Tembec at the time had initiated the first HAP. My role back then was, as Elena mentioned in the intro, was with Mushkegowuk Environmental Research Center as the technical advisor. And in 2018, there was a site visit that took place on the Martel Forest and Chapeau Crown Game Preserve. Later on in the slides, you'll see a picture of that visit. In 2020, oh, sorry, I think I missed 2018. Oh yes, that's what I was hired. So they created that community liaison position in 2020. That's the next slide, sorry. The HAP core team was also created to begin discussion on the HAP 2.0 action plan, and they began to meet quarterly. And then the HAP 2.0 webinar series was launched. And in 2021, HAP 2.0 activities continued during the COVID-19 pandemic, and Natural Resources Canada provided support to the Guardian program as well. And 2022 is where we are today, meeting with the HAP 2.0 mini symposium. Next slide. There's that's the first visit that we had at the Chapeau Crown Game Preserve. I don't think I was working at that time, but I was volunteering at that time. I think it's hard to remember. Next slide, please. So what was the goal? To look at the needs and challenges related to forestry renewal and forest stand management. And as a result, HAP 2.0 Partnership Action Plan was created through an exchange of information by researchers, Indigenous knowledge keepers, forestry professionals, and civil culturists. Participants represented industry, federal and provincial governments, and Indigenous enterprise and Indigenous communities, all working together to form a HAP 2.0 Partnership Action Plan. Next slide, please. So listed here are all who were involved with the action plan and a part of the HAP core team as well. I don't think I need to, well, I'll just read them real quick. Green First Forest Products, Wakatone Development Incorporated, Canadian Fiber Center, Indigenous Communities, and the Ministry of Northern Development, Mines and Natural Resources Forestry. Next slide. So what was needed was to begin weaving technology and Indigenous knowledge as they relate to forest vegetation management by bringing participants together in support of discussing the herbicide alternative project going forward. Next slide. In total, we had 13 webinars which were held from 2020 to 2022. Presenters were given the opportunity to share forestry knowledge and technology in Indigenous communities, and the Indigenous communities were able to provide presentations on the forestry activities through the webinar sessions. Those are just some samples of some of the posters I had sent out as part of the communication. So in the beginning, we had 19 key participants, and by the end of the webinar series, our participants increased to 30 participants. We opted not to post through Facebook to keep the key people as our audience. And each month, well, I already mentioned that I distributed the posters. Next slide. So what did the webinar entail? The first objective was a 45-minute presentation followed by a 15-minute Q&A, and creating and capturing various ideas and to a large community of participants, also to discuss any opportunities. The second objective was to build a knowledge network of resource of participating in knowledge sharing in HAP 2.0 to help build enthusiasm. We had alternating speakers from technical presentations such as Chris Edge, Kara Webster, and Indigenous presenters such as Sue Chibble on behalf of the Tech Elders on the natural law of the land, Kathy Ando from the Tachuan First Nation on her perspectives of forestry activities in her territory. Next slide. In addition to the webinar series, I observed or recognized that a 45-minute presentation with a 15-minute question period was not enough time for the participants to completely engage. So I proposed that we introduce a roundtable 1 week after the webinar so that the participants had time to reflect on the presentation and to fully engage in discussion during the roundtable. I also wanted a safe space where we could discuss openly the issues of chemical herbicide application within our territories. This was brought forward to the HAP core team and approved, and they had agreed that a less structured virtual meeting. And so we held roundtables 1 week after the webinar presentations. I also kept in mind the reconciliation process and provided an opening and closing prayer and smudge, as well as a sacred medicine bundle to the Indigenous community leaders and to the presenters to show honor and respect, and for the knowledge being provided during the webinars. The roundtable seemed to be a safe space for further discussions without the time constraints of the webinar. So we began to develop a positive working relationship during the roundtables, since it provided more time for reflection and previous presentations so that we could discuss further, and even just chatting, about what was happening in each other's territories and land became part of the discussion as well. So getting to know one another and our territories. As the Anishinaabe people, we like to visit each other, and that's just a part of our culture. So I thought that was I kind of enjoyed the roundtable series myself. Next slide. Benefits and consequences. So I thought that we had pretty good communication during the webinar presentation and the roundtable. I thought it went well. We also, we especially during a time when we couldn't visit each other, we couldn't visit each other's communities. So this was our only communication tool, and I thought it went pretty good. So being able to connect that once a month, it was rather than face to face, it developed a positive relationship. At the same time, each community were able to see what each other's needs were at the time and to hear each other's concerns. So once again, we began to discuss alternatives to applying chemical or herbicides. It wasn't forgotten and is now being talked about across Canada today, how to improve forestry and vegetation management within Canada, keeping in mind the detrimental impacts it may cause. So more benefits are providing the ecosystem classification training with Wakatoan regarding the importance of soils with Paul Hazlitt and Kim Chapman. And I was also able to provide Indigenous knowledge regarding plants and trees and met with the guardians for medicine walks. Some of the consequences, I thought it opened up the dialogue regarding forestry and herbicide alternative project in a positive way. And together we were able to weave that technology and Indigenous knowledge for the project with Wakatoan. Next slide. Oh, that's it for me, which I think that's one more thing I think I forgot. I also brought some awareness about some of the protocols to Natural Resources Canada and brought some of the things that needed to come forward during that time. Is there any questions?
Great, thank you, Isabel. I don't think I see any questions in the chat, but we'll wait a minute and see if any come in. So feel free to raise your hand. Oh, Heather McDonald, you can go ahead.
Thanks, Isabel. I really enjoyed that presentation. I'm just learning. My question I had asked earlier about whether I don't know what is going on locally to Sault Ste. Marie, closer to Sault Ste. Marie, but I wonder if they're using chemical pesticides or pesticides closer to Sault Ste. Marie in perhaps the Batchewana First Nation traditional territory or Garden River First Nation territory. You might not know, but I'm just curious whether it's common closer to home. I know the work that you've done closer to your home community, but I wondered what it's like here closer to GLFC.
I'm not really sure if I can answer that question, but I know that they do spray along the lake shore, along the highway. Like I have witnessed spraying there, but that's I don't think that's with forestry. That's more with the Ministry of Transportation. So I'm not sure. Maybe Chris would be able to answer that question.
Yeah, I can answer that, Heather. It's very infrequent on public land or on the Algoma Forest, for example. It's a Great Lakes St. Lawrence forest for the most part. In the northern areas towards Wawa, you have the transition into the boreal region. So the amount of chemical tending on the Algoma forest would be very modest and would be generally related to restoring white pine, for example, on the forest at a small scale within shelterwood type harvest, for example. So much just different in that context because of the forest.
Thank you.
I see a question in the chat from Lynn. She says, Isabel mentioned this program is now being looked at in other places in Canada. Could you give examples about where?
Some of the participants that attended were from, I think Edmonton was Natural Resource Canada. We had one of the key people there that wanted to know more, and then in BC they were also wanting more information, but I can't recall their name of the organization. Maybe Nelson would remember.
Thank you, Isabel. Well, I could not name any specific person, but yes, indeed, you know, the same challenges related to vegetation management is being faced all across Canada, and it's a very hot topic. For example, in the Atlantic region. I was, for example, in New Brunswick earlier this week, and this is one of the main ways of managing forest vegetation is by using chemical herbicides. So everything we're doing here in HAP certainly has some impacts, will certainly have some impacts eventually in other places across Canada.
Thank you, Nelson. Thanks, Isabel. Were there any other questions about this story? Or comments? Oh.
I can't see it.
I'll read the question in the chat. Is anyone testing the active land users for any herbicides or pesticides in their system? I bring it up as some farmers have tested positive for glyphosate in their urine. Our people are always picking medicines and foods from their territories.
We did some tracking of that, not really tracking, but we had some, when we were working with the scientist, what's his name there from the lake, from Sudbury, I forget his name, David Pearson. He had the students not actually testing humans, but doing a lot of research on what animals consume different plants and what happened with the animals when they consumed different plants and how much was in their system. And it didn't affect the humans, I guess, or the moose as much as what people would think. And I don't know I haven't gone that far as to looking at research with humans other than in the States. I think there was someone that had gone to court for it, but it was more of they actually got sprayed with it on their body, so they weren't actually ingesting it. And that's the only one that I know of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I haven't heard about that study of glyphosate in farmers, but if somebody could share that in the chat, that would be really interesting.
Right. Sorry, there's another question. I just can't.
Yes.
These glasses are brand new. I can't see.
It's just asking where
adjust.
the webinars can be found. I think the link was shared, but it can be posted again so that you can all see.
It's on the Walkaton site.
Go ahead.
So all
David.
the webinars are posted there.
Thanks, Elena. David Flood here, General Manager for Walkaton Development. I just wanted to provide a little bit of a supplement. It's related to some of the active work we've done at the time Elena was brought on board as a biologist intern. There is a fair amount of new science coming forward on the persistence of glyphosate in stem shoots, roots, fruit of plants, which I believe we share these reports on our website as well. And there has been some studies on genetic mutation of moose as it relates to their mouth formation in forming an underbite, knowing that moose are a clipping animal. and that their jaw is extended, and then there's an extended underbite. And they believe that that's got to do with some fetus genetic mutation. So I think there's an unwritten storyboard on the kind of persistence and the kind of genetic impacts that can happen to the animal. I know in BC there was a real cause for concern because they were finding animals out west with full bellies of food and no other seeming health condition, and then why are they dying? And they were in and around spray areas. So I think there's still work to be done, and I would guess if the animals are bioaccumulating, then there's a likely chance that humans would be as well. And I've still yet to meet a forester or a company rep from Monsanto to take a glass of water at the prescribed spray rate on the landscape and drink it. That's just, you know, on the basis that it has no impact. I was being facetious with that point, that last point.
Thanks for sharing, David. That's a good point that I think there's a lot of research that we're just going to see come out in the next couple of years on that subject. I mean, the study that found glyphosate persisting in plant roots for up to or over a decade, that was just published about a year ago now. And yeah, I think that there's a link to that on our website as well. Okay, so if there aren't any other questions or comments, I think we can move on to the third story. I do see there's another comment in the chat from Aaron Brown in watershed water in Ontario as well. Okay. All right, so the third story for this afternoon, I will be sharing with all of you. So I'll reintroduce myself quickly for anybody who missed the first couple minutes of the session today. My name is Alina McCullough. I'm a member of Chapleau Cree First Nation. I'm currently a master's candidate at the University of Guelph. And my research is partnering with Wakatoan Development. And previous to that, I was a biologist intern with Wakatoan. So the story that I will be sharing today is about our pursuit of herbicide buffers for late winter moose habitat on the forests that overlap the traditional territories of Wakatoan's owner communities. So I'm going to begin the story today by giving a little bit of background on the relationship between First Nations and moose. So First Nations in Canada have maintained a relationship with moose for thousands of years, not just as a source of food or materials, but as community members that coexist in the same landscape, or some might say in the same home, and help each other not only to survive, but to live a good life there. So for example, the moose gives itself to the hunter to provide for the people, and people would engage in practices like setting fires to create habitat for moose. And this relationship still exists and is very relevant today. And as I hope this story will show, it's actually what drove this project that I'll be sharing with all of you today. Wakatoan has a mandate for moose recovery from its owner First Nations because of concerns about the declining moose population in the Northeast Superior region, which is an area with lots of industrial activity, including forestry, which can dramatically change the landscape where this relationship between humans and moose has played out for generations. And one specific concern is that forestry is affecting the amount of late winter habitat available to moose. So late winter habitat is of particular concern because that's the time of year when moose are at their lowest body condition and need to conserve energy in order to survive. So if moose have to travel through deep crusted snow, they may actually expend more energy getting to food than they get from consuming that food. So in winter, moose need access to both coniferous cover, which provides shelter and shallow snow conditions, as well as open areas that provide deciduous browse. So late winter habitats have both of these components intermixed. When foraging in winter, especially later in the winter when snow is deeper and harder to move through, moose tend to stick close to the edges between these two habitat types, not venturing far from cover habitat. And that is especially true for cows with calves, who may also be pregnant at this time and have higher energy demands, while also preferring to stay close to cover for protection. Given that Wakatoan has this moose recovery mandate and is also a collaborator on HAP, we, along with our owner lands and resource departments, wondered about the impact that herbicide might be having on winter habitat, specifically the browse component of winter habitat. Not only was there concern that herbicide would reduce the abundance of deciduous browse available to moose in winter, but there are questions about how glyphosate-based herbicides might affect the quality or the nutrients available in that sprayed vegetation. And that's another area of that emerging research that David sort of brought up a minute ago, is how might it change, for instance, the mineral composition of plants to be sprayed with glyphosate. So based on these concerns and some of the information that we gathered on moose habitat and behavior in winter, in the spring of 2021, we made a proposal to the SFLs operating on our owner community's traditional territories. We asked that areas identified as winter habitats by the NDMNRF's moose habitat queries have a 100-meter herbicide buffer applied to them in order to protect the edge habitat where moose forage in winter. So by implementing this proposal, we hoped that during times of low body condition, when snow limits the movement of moose, there would be healthy, abundant deciduous browse easily accessible to them within 100 meters of their cover habitat. And by asking that this be applied across the entire forest, as opposed to just in designated moose emphasis areas, we were taking a precautionary approach. And that precautionary approach was motivated by the fact that the moose population is below objective ranges in over half of the wildlife management units in this region. Because we don't have all the information on how glyphosate might be affecting the nutritional quality of browse, and because the effectiveness of moose emphasis areas has not been assessed, and they've only existed on these forests for a couple of years at most at this point. And of course, this was also motivated by that very significant relationship between our owner First Nations and moose. So after making this proposal, we discovered that if we wanted a quick response, we'd need to modify it a little, and we'd need to work with our customized consultation agreement and relationship table to do so. So a joint task team was created, which included staff from Wakatoan, from our lands and resource departments, and from the Northeast Regional NDMNRF. So that was the Herbicide and Moose Habitat Management Task Team, or HMHM. So we realized that implementing our proposal would require more long-term planning, since it would affect not only where forest managers could apply herbicide, but where they could plant trees. So in order to come up with a strategy that could be applied in the short term, the region suggested grounding our request in the current forest management guidelines and silviculture ground rules. So for example, the best management practices for moose emphasis areas instruct to, if possible, avoid spraying areas that would best support the production of browse. So we would restrict this short-term modified proposal to the MEAs because this instruction already exists for forest managers. And the silviculture ground rules require 70% of stands to return to conifer free-to-grow status, leaving 30% that can be left untreated. So rather than applying a buffer, for the sake of this, again, short-term modified version of our proposal, we would ask forest managers to create no herbicide zones that didn't interfere with returning 70% of the stands to free-to-grow conifer. So in the fall of 2021, the HMHM group met with 4 forest managers representing 7 forest management units, and the region presented guidelines for delineating no herbicide zones within MEAs to provide for moose browse within the parameters of the requirements to regenerate conifer-dominated forest. So some key features for choosing where to establish these no herbicide zones, or as some people refer to them as moose restaurants, included proximity to winter cover, to water bodies, which are also important habitat for moose, and ensuring that they were a good distance from roads or other areas where human activity might discourage moose. So while Wakatoan did support this strategy, in these meetings, we did still advocate for a precautionary approach. We still advocated for being mindful of moose browse throughout the entire forest and not just MEAs, and advocating for more boots on the ground monitoring in collaboration with our Guardian program. So the consequences of this approach as of right now are still sort of to be determined. We don't know how these recommendations made by the HMHM group will be factored into the 2022 spray plans yet. But I will mention that in 2021, Green First Forest Products, at the time they were RIAM, did incorporate that mindfulness of providing moose browse into their 2021 net down process. And of course, they are collaborators on the HAP program. And in the HMHM meetings last fall, some of the SFLs did offer to review their spray plans with Wakatoan once they were ready and involve Guardians in going out and walking blocks as part of the net down process. And some forests have proposed piloting these no spray areas and have acknowledged the need to plan long term when it comes to where and what trees can be planted in MEAs in order to reduce the dependence on herbicide treatment in those areas. But again, we are currently waiting to see what those 2022 spray plans actually look like and how the process of netting down will be different from previous years. So in the meantime, one of the biggest outcomes of this approach so far, I believe, is that it helped us in building relationships with regional biologists and foresters on the HMHM team, many of which we are still collaborating with on a new initiative, a new task team where we are developing collaborative moose monitoring activities. So in terms of next steps, those monitoring activities are one exciting thing that we're planning on starting this summer. And one of the things we're going to look at with that is establishing pallet plots in sprayed and non-sprayed areas to investigate whether there's a difference in moose density. And we're going to be involving Guardians, as Amberly mentioned, in that project, as well as community members in general. And hopefully with that, we'll be able to start answering some of the questions that I brought up at the beginning of this story, which as of right now, I still can't really answer, and I hope that doesn't feel too anticlimactic. But I will be trying to answer some of those questions with my master's research, which will use both Indigenous knowledge and Western science to better understand the habitat needs of moose in the winter. So I'm currently a student in Dr. Jesse Pop's WISE lab. And as I mentioned, working in collaboration with Wakatoan Development and our 3 owner First Nations. My goal with my project is to use two-eyed seeing with the strengths of both Western and Indigenous knowledge to create a model for moose winter habitat in the Northeast Superior region that is acceptable to both knowledge systems, and to create maps and other products that are useful to our lands and resource departments specifically. So this is a really cool project because it gives me the opportunity to create something useful for these communities, including the First Nation that I belong to, and the opportunity to use both Western and Indigenous knowledge systems, as well as Indigenous methodologies, which I don't know if I would have been able to do otherwise in academia. So it's very exciting, and I feel very fortunate to have that opportunity, which might not exist if it hadn't been for this project of pursuing herbicide buffers for late winter moose habitat. And obviously, as I wrap up this story, we still have yet to get those buffers that we initially asked for. But I personally do see what we've been able to accomplish so far as progress in the right direction. And I was happy to have people with the ministry perspective help us in putting together something that is doable with the tools that are available to us as of right now, again, so that we can at least change something in this next round of spray plans and annual work schedules. So with that being said, I definitely don't regret our initial proposal, even though some might say it was unrealistic, because I do think that it communicated pretty clearly what our communities really want to see happening in the forest, which is reducing herbicide all the way to zero and more consideration of what moose need in order to live a good life in this landscape that we share with them. So thank you so much for listening, and I think we have a couple minutes for questions. I see there's a comment in the chat from Lynn. How can we get these type of approaches brought into forestry degree programs? What Alina is doing with Dr. Tracy Pop and the amazing new program at U of Guelph is fantastic. I'm not aware of this thinking or learning being brought into forestry, wildlife, or silviculture courses. Does anyone know if this is happening anywhere else in forestry programs? So does anybody on the call know of any forestry programs that are involving Indigenous methodologies or two-eyed seeing in any courses? I personally don't, but I wonder if any of the foresters on the call do.
If I may, Alina, I don't specifically know about anything like that. There are some colleagues, of course, in academia, in forestry faculties who are looking into Indigenous ways and aspects as they relate to forestry, but not specifically using Indigenous ways of knowing as applied to silviculture questions. Or so maybe it exists, but I think this is a very good question by Lynn.
I see Isabel Soulier commented Algoma U. Do you want to maybe tell us about that, Isabel?
In a second, I would just recall them trying to develop, it was a land-based course, but I don't think it was land use planning. I think it might have been, had a different name, but I don't recall the name. That was a few years ago. So wonder whether or not they got it off the ground. That I'd have to look into that, but that would be one place to look. With the initial department.
David?
Yeah, thank you. I noted Algoma U has that really interesting, every 3 years, a very large land symposium, Indigenous-led land symposium, as the extension work. And I'll focus on that word extension work, because quite often what happens is Indigenous practitioners are invited in to share information, have a discussion, but it's not necessarily put into academia teaching practice. So I think we're at a bit of a pivot point where this is going to become more common practice. And I think the WISE Lab that Elena gets to participate in is cultivating that kind of capacity and energy and knowledge systems for two-eyed seeing that we'll have to figure out a way to introduce that into the schools of environmental sciences across Canada and those that develop professional foresters. And just to toot Wakatoan's horn a little bit, that's why we exist. We exist to try and fill the gap of practitioner needs at our community level and create the geopolitical voice to make that change. And we're doing that through collaboration. And I hope everyone's enjoying the symposium so far, because we're not a tribal council. We're not the chief and council. We're an entity created on their behalf to, we're like the Great Lakes Forest Center. We're like an education institution. We're driving a Guardian program. So we're something unique, and we're proud of the 6 years we spent getting to where we are. And we think there's another good decade ahead of us for fundamental change.
Thanks, David. And I guess I will add that I don't know of any specific forestry programs, but there are definitely forestry academics and researchers who do use these sort of methodologies in their research, like Peggy Smith and Deb McGregor are two examples that I can think of. So I guess we can move on to our fourth story of the afternoon. So our fourth story actually has 3 authors, and I'll introduce all of them briefly. Kim is a forest biologist with the Great Lakes Forestry Center of Natural Resources Canada. She specializes in ecological classification. Rob is a research scientist with the Great Lakes Forestry Center. He conducts research in soil science, forest ecology, and stand dynamics. And Nelson is a research scientist with the Canadian Wood Fibre Centre of Natural Resources Canada. His focus is on silviculture research, being interested in stand establishment practices in boreal and subboreal ecosystems. And I believe the story today is going to be presented by Rob and Nelson.
Yes, thank you, Elena. Thank you all for being with us today and for providing us with this opportunity to share this story about how our scientists' perspective on knowing ecosystems. And as Elena mentioned, well, the central character to this story is, in fact, Kim Chapman, and she should be the one telling you about it. Unfortunately, Kim is not feeling very well today, so Rob and I will do our best to tell you that story. So next slide, please. As for some of the other presentations so far, this story begins with a group of people out in the woods. So you might recognize some of them, and maybe you were there. The context was, of course, a HAP field tour, during which colleagues from RIAM, GreenFirst, brought us to different sites to look at forest renewal challenges and successes. So for those of you who were there, you will remember that it was a fantastic fall day. The colors were vivid. The smell was great. People were happy to meet. Discussions were interesting. We were sharing ideas. We were discussing forests, ecosystems, worldviews, ways of knowing, silviculture, and I'd say most importantly, we were getting to know each other. So next slide, please. One element that was most fascinating, at least for me, was to see how a particular thing, situation, or setting could be seen through so many complementary angles. And here I'm not just talking about entirely different paradigms, such as the indigenous holistic worldview versus the Western science empirical view. No, what I'm talking about is even within a single paradigm, things can be seen quite differently. So for example, while we were listening to Wayne Bell, who was explaining fascinating facts about the ecology of certain plants and how they reproduce, how they interact with their environment, and how they interact with, how they respond to disturbances, Rob and I, together with Dave Morris and Gordon Kayahara, we were looking at newly planted seedlings, such as the one that you can see here. And Rob, you probably remember how I was telling you that from my perspective, having been involved in regeneration research in Quebec since 1997, in a context in Quebec, again, where herbicides were banned in 2001, I was really looking at the seedling, focusing on the seedling level. So I was thinking about seedling ecophysiology. So about how this newly planted tree was struggling to access environmental resources while competing for light, nutrients, and water with all the surrounding vegetation. And I was also talking about how microsite characteristics, so at the seedling level, played a central role in its success at getting established. I was also mentioning that we've investigated different alternatives to herbicides in Ontario and Quebec already in a variety of ecosystems. And I was thinking with all this past research, whether something we've tried in Quebec or elsewhere could even work here. So next slide, please.
Yes, absolutely, Nelson. Meanwhile, I was also looking at the overall surroundings, and this brought to mind how the success of different regeneration approaches vary with the characteristics of the ecosystem. And here you can see that in the upper left of the slide, that's different climate regions. In the lower left, we have soil properties, whether it's that textural triangle on the left or the humus form, that's a type of forest floor that we have, or the topography up in the upper right there. And all that goes together to have an effect on the overstory and the understory plants. Well, as you may be able to tell, I've been researching regeneration techniques and stand dynamics in Northern Ontario for a long time. And given my training in soil science and forest ecology, I've always been particularly interested in how different ecosystems function. Next slide, please. And I remember during the first HAP field tour, discussing with Dave Morris, Ken Lennon, and Doug Reed, the idea that site constraints to forest growth vary over time and in different ways in different ecosystems. And in this slide, we show how the relative constraints of different types vary over time. And in particular, understory vegetation may have a great effect on the early growth of trees, but as the stand develops, it has less and less impact. And so we may overestimate the impact or the effectiveness of some types of vegetation control if we only look at stands that are very young. Well, during these tours, we also talked with Isabelle Soulier, David Flood, Carla Tangi, Isabel Allen, and Travis Jones about using all of one's senses to relate to an ecosystem and the intimate link between plants, animals, and topography. And it seemed evident that for HAP to help with changing silvicultural practices, we needed a unified reference framework to help us exchange ideas, to understand one another, and to continue building consensus. That's not only amongst the scientists, but as a group of people with different worldviews, life experiences, motivations, and goals.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Rob. And what is fantastic, I think, about this story is this is what happened that very night. Some of you, again, were probably there during this meeting, and this night was quite inspiring, in fact. So all of us, after this one of these field tour, we were positively engaging in respectful discussions. For example, and you can see on the walls there, trying to organize our thoughts, capture ideas, identify opportunities, and this is all thanks to the handwriting of Stephanie Seymour, who was taking notes on the board for us. And then while we were trying to identify concrete next actions for the group and for HAP to go forward, this is when Kim made a fantastic suggestion. So next slide, please.
Yes, indeed. Kim came up with the idea of building an ecological framework, particularly for HAP purposes. So the idea was to promote greater ecosystem awareness and understanding, where one might find particular species and the habitats that they would prefer. This would give us a common ecological language to discuss silviculture approaches, to integrate knowledge from past experiments, and to provide a more holistic approach to Western science that might better resonate with the traditional ecological knowledge of Indigenous partners. And in this case, we're showing that for those of you not familiar with an ecological framework or classification, we've plotted soil moisture regime, so how much water is available. On the y-axis above, we've shown the soil nutrient regime, or what's the nutrient availability on the site. And within that, we can assign different plant communities to different types of sites. So that way, and pardon me, could I have the next slide, please? So since then, Kim, with the help of Daniel Gouge, has combined ecosystem classifications from Ontario and Quebec, together with the Canadian National Vegetation Classification, to develop an ecological framework that specifically is relevant to HAP objectives. So in this case, you can see that there are several different types of plant communities, overstory and understory types. And they can be related together in a matrix where we show across the top and going down the columns are different understory types, and along the side and then going across are different overstory types. And we can place these different types of plant communities within that framework. And so we get a series of overstory and understory vegetation classes and related soil conditions, which can be used to identify and describe different ecosystems or site types. Kim has concentrated on elements that we think are the most important drivers of vegetation competition, because competition is the major issue with trying to grow trees without the use of herbicides. So we've now shared the first approximation with the HAP core team and vetted it with several HAP scientists to make sure it aligns with the overall HAP objectives. Right now, it is under peer review by independent classification experts to ensure that it has a strong scientific foundation. Our plan is then to engage the various HAP partners to co-develop a more inclusive revised version of the framework going forward. And I think that's particularly important to emphasize. This is only the first approximation. Nelson?
Yes, next slide, please. So meanwhile, under, again, the leadership of Kim and with the help of Danielle Gouge and Ollie Dayton, we compiled a list of about 150 silviculture studies, mostly from Ontario and Quebec, conducted in regions that have some relevance for the HAP context. And we organized these studies into a digital compendium of sort. So basically, we built a database in which we've dissected each one of these 150 or so studies as much as we could. So we identifying where the study was conducted, the characteristics of the forest stands in which the trials were established, the treatments that were tested, the duration of the study, etc. So for example, a given line in the database that you can see here at the top would identify study A conducted by Dr. Jane Doe, published in 19 something, in which the researchers compare, for example, disc drenching, mechanical site preparation with chemical herbicides to see how it influences black spruce growth. And all this, for example, in interaction with different stock types, meaning small seedlings or larger seedlings. So we are now at this point where in a few of these studies, we need to complete the database. Some of them were published in French, so we need someone who is fluent in French to be able to get all the information and feed that into the database. But most importantly, we want to associate each one of these studies with one of the ecological classes of the framework Rob talked about just a minute ago. Next slide, please. And in this way, we think that both this compendium and the framework will enable capturing learnings from the past to find new solutions for today and into the future. And by tying this information together, it should open possibilities. So enabling new ways of interpreting results, for example, potentially leading to new ways of mapping sites using different remote sensing technologies. Also, we think that by combining these results from the compendium with the framework could help focusing efforts for monitoring those sites that we think can be more at risk. So next slide, please.
All right, well, thank you, Nelson. Then moving forward, what's next? While we now have a first approximation, we expect the framework to evolve over time with new knowledge and application. So this would include training and field identification of plants and soils. This would involve working together to find the most appropriate tools for the diversity of partners so we can consistently identify sites. It would also be testing and modifying the framework. And this will hopefully involve forestry practitioners, lands and resource managers, knowledge keepers and elders, and youth guardians using the framework and providing feedback. In particular, we wonder whether the framework can be enriched with Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing, two-eyed seeing, as well as that of experienced forestry practitioners. Are there more meaningful ways to teach and learn about the ecology? and to help foster connections between people, plants, and the land. For example, through storytelling or gathering particular plants for nourishment and well-being. And then finally, utilizing the framework and the compendium. Can the framework and the compendium be used effectively to help develop decision support tools for silviculture, such as stock type selection, and for other values on the land, such as moose habitat evaluation? And it was wonderful to hear about Elena's studies in that regard. To what extent can they be a starting point for further applications and interpretation? So this is our story to date, and we are certainly looking forward to the next chapter. Thank you.
Thank you, Miigwech.
Thank you, Rob and Nelson. Do we have any questions for this presentation? Go ahead, David.
I was just checking in actually with Kim and Nelson there in terms of accessibility and launch. I'm not actually sure if we've kind of got grounded on if this will be an outward facing product in the near term. Did we ever think about timeline for that? I can't remember what we said.
Yes, David, you're absolutely right. We discussed about that maybe a few months ago, and our hope is really to have a first version of the companion. It's online now, but we just need to complete a few studies and add a few information in a few columns because before we can share it more widely. But so in the coming months, we have Daniel Gouge who is joining us again for a short-term contract to complete some of these fields, and hopefully, I think by midsummer we should have a first complete version of the compendium. Yes.
Oh, it's exciting. Good to hear.
Yeah. Thanks, David.
I had a question there. Thanks, fellas, for that presentation. Rob, you mentioned training and field ID. Can you just talk a little bit about just add a little bit of description to that in terms of the what that would entail, how you would see that unfolding going forward?
Well, we're pretty open-ended about this, but going back to how this has traditionally been done or previously been done with ecological classification, it would involve going out in the field, number one, and then looking for, in terms of plant identification or habitat identification in terms of different plant typologies, different plant communities, then identifying those and identifying the characteristic species that occur there. So we're probably not going to be looking at trying to get identification of all species, of rare species and so forth, but we'd be looking at what are the characteristic species for a different kind of community or a given site type. And similarly, we would probably be looking at soil types too, because soil is a very good identifier of what's likely going to happen on a site in terms of silviculture as well as in terms of the plant communities. So there we would dig soil pits. We describe how to assess soil, soil texture, how to look for soil moisture by looking at the condition of models or glaying in the soil profile, but go over some of these principles that really drive those ecosystems. And again, we would like to be fairly open-minded about how to do this. We at the present time, we certainly recognize the need to do this because without that, then it's very difficult to classify sites and particularly to do it consistently. So that's one of the real keys to using an ecological classification in a purposeful way, is to be able to consistently do it from one person to the next.
And Rob, could we add also that, in fact, last year, Kim and Isabelle Soulier were involved in some sort of a first first try of this transfer of knowledge, of course, and under the constraints of COVID, they organized these training sessions with guardians, in which Kim would explain things about ecological classification, and Isabel would tell stories and explain the traditional ways of seeing plants and ecosystems. So maybe this could serve as a spark, and we could extend from them, just from there. So this is one way that it could be done.
Yes, and certainly that exchange of knowledge between different groups, different people, different types of knowledge keepers, you might say, in the field, doing this sort of thing, I think is really invaluable. So certainly having Indigenous people involved, forestry practitioners involved, the spectrum of people that this would be useful to for trying to come up with some common way, or at least of viewing ecosystems.
Yeah,
So
that ties back into Amberly's presentation at the beginning, where she was talking about how this framework was presented to the Guardians last summer. So there's that knowledge transfer that you were talking about, both between knowledge systems and also between generations.
Yeah, Wayne Bell here. I would add the ecosystem classification adds some more refinement to the system that we've been using in Ontario for probably over 20 years now, and that's the humanidaphic grid format, where we take people, assign them as plants, give them the traits for the plants, and then assign them into communities, into a grid. And then within that grid, we have various levels of water and food and other things that they compete for. And we've done that, everything from say grade 7 students right through to professional foresters within the ministry and within the industry part. And I think it really helps them to get personal look at what an ecosystem classification might be and why it's important to understand the ecology, not just the soils, but the ecology, more importantly, the ecology of how those plants react to those soil and competition levels. And more specifically, we need to know about 8 to 10 plants, right? So from the competition point of view, and then as well as all the other plants of traditional values and where they fit into the system as well, so we can start to see how all that works. Chris, I believe you probably were involved in one of those back in the Tembec days, one of those in the field with Jeff Leach, but we've done probably about, I don't know, 40 to 50 of those at this point in time. So we do have a system where we can take what Kim's developed here with a little bit of refinement, put it into what we've been doing for the past 20 plus years, and add in the ecology of the plants. And I should say we're Holly Dayton and I are working on a paper right now where we're looking at plant response on a fire regime and silvicultural intensity gradient. So a 3D response of how all the 10 different traits of plants respond to these disturbances, so that we can add a lot more insight into how the various plants, right down to, so when I say plants, I mean 306 vascular plant species, how the cumulative traits of those respond to just fire regimes and silvicultural intensity disturbances. So we've got quite a bit to add to this story. Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you for adding that, Wayne. So I think we're right on time now to start our 5th and final story of this section of the session, and then we'll all get a 15-minute break. So our 5th story comes from Jason Shabaga. Jason is a postdoctoral research associate working for Microtech Inc. under the guidance of Dave Morris from the Ministry of Natural Resources, Northern Affairs, Mines and Forests, and Nelson Tifo from the Canadian Wood Fiber Centre. He has worked on several research projects related to silviculture and soil health in Ontario and Alaskan forests, with a particular interest in how disturbances affect plant productivity and soil carbon dynamics in northern forests.
Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate being invited to speak at this. I'm still, I think, a fairly new face in this community, which is, I'm really impressed to see the scope and the types of backgrounds that are being represented here. It's a really interesting and unique experience, and I'm really grateful to be a part of that. I'd also like to acknowledge I'm actually speaking to you from Florida at the moment. I'm finding my way back up in 2 days' time to Sault Ste. Marie, where I'll be settling for the indeterminate future, working as part of with Microtech and other partners. And I'd like to acknowledge that these lands were originally inhabited by the Putano and Timucua people, and this is part of what is now Alachua County today. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit to you about the interplay, the dynamics between roots and soils and plants, and how that may be and has in large part been sort of underrepresented in our approach to restoring forests after harvesting. You could go to the next slide, please. So we'll just start with talking about the fundamentals. You're likely all very familiar with what type of harvesting practices are utilized in the Boreal Forest of Ontario. One of the primary, not the only, but one of the primary methods that's used for species like white spruce or black spruce or aspen is clear cutting. There are many good reasons to utilize this. It removes large blocks of trees in a way that in some ways resembles fire disturbances. And this sort of helps with providing the light and access to resources that all these trees depend on following what would normally be a fire event. And it's also economically convenient to do that. So there are benefits to that. However, there are also drawbacks to that. Firstly, we're not actually burning, so we're not restoring a lot of the material that is being removed right onto the site again. There's mechanical activity, which can cause potential damage to soils and maybe adjacent forest. There's a lack of remaining mature cover, which may persist in some cases following fire events. And there's a lack of a seed bank associated with that. A lot of these tree species have serotinous cones, and so they can disperse after fire. And so as a consequence, we need to replant these areas. And when we replant them, there are a lot of challenges to the survival of the seedlings that are regenerating in these areas. They face a lot of stress in their environment, and it's very competitive. And that's a theme that's been coming up a lot through these talks, is the importance of understanding how plants are competing. Because there's a lot of other plants who also want to grow in those spaces, and they're trying to go to the top. So if we would like to restore the forest to some extent as it was, we need to help provide, we often need to provide some assistance in some cases. So we can go to the next slide. One approach is and has historically been to use herbicide. And this helps to knock back some of the early plant growth that would be competing with tree seedlings. And while it's effective and relatively inexpensive compared to, say, mechanical brush tending in very, very large areas, there are some drawbacks as well. While we can use more modern methods of precise application, there's still a lot of risk that it will become dispersed further than we intend, particularly after rains and with runoff events. What it does is it will actually kill off a lot of the vegetation early on, which means that the early regrowth that would restabilize the soils and cover it, and minimize erosion effects, is now being inhibited. And this can also lead to soil nutrient losses and increased breakdown of some of the materials in the soil. So it has potential drawbacks in terms of greater negative impacts on soils in terms of structure and its ability to help other plants grow forward. It can persist for long periods of time and be transported to sensitive areas. And ultimately, although it's a lot less expensive than, say, mechanical tending in many ways, it's still not inexpensive. It could be hundreds to thousands per hectare, depending on how it's being applied. Can we go to the next slide, please? So while there are many potential alternatives, which is a big part of HAP here, one such emerging recognition, or something that's been known in part for a long time, but really not well developed and understood, especially at larger scales, is the relevance of mycorrhizae. And these are fungi that are naturally present in the soil that form symbiotic relationships with the roots of trees and virtually all plants, really. And they are able to more effectively help those plants grow. So they provide access to small amounts of nutrients that are otherwise very challenging for the plants to get. When they're in established forests, they can actually interconnect trees together, and they can help share resources amongst trees. And in return, the trees give them sugar, because who doesn't like sugar, right? And so this is a beneficial relationship for all the people, or rather all the organisms involved. Unfortunately, clear cutting is, because of the kind of extent of the removal, it doesn't tend to leave many trees behind. And there are ways, there are methods in which, sometimes more is left behind, but in broad strokes, we're removing large swaths of trees, we're killing off the roots, and so therefore these microbiota also die off, the fungi also die. And so as a result, we are not leaving an environment which is really conductive to reestablishment and regrowth of these trees in its ideal way. There's no mother trees to speak of, and these are trees that are well established and that can help nurse new incoming trees. It will come back, but it can take a long time for this to happen. And as a consequence, this can limit the survival of the replanted trees, and it will therefore also increase the likelihood of erosion and soil nutrient losses. Next slide, please. So if we're trying to move beyond herbicide, and I think we're all in agreement that that is what we are trying to do here, we want to continue to provide for the forestry as a part of the ecological framework, as a part of the community, as a part of the economy of these regions. We need to provide competitive advantages to regrowing forests that are encouraging a more healthy soil structure, that have fewer or detrimental elements associated with this otherwise, potentially, destructive event, and preferably ones that are not very expensive to implement. So we go to the next slide, please. And this sort of ties in with the last slide. There are, many components in terms of those who are affected by this. People, for example, the First Nations and the SFL holders in the area were challenged by the use of these herbicides to maintain healthy, diverse, and economically productive ecosystems. Forests, wetlands, because everything eventually drains, and eventually drains either into the water table or into surface waters, which are then, of course, interacted with by wildlife, fish, etc. So the entire watershed, the entire region is potentially at risk for any kind of negative consequence associated with things like herbicide use or forestry activity. So we want to do what we can to minimize that. Next slide, please. This is a long build-up to go back to mycorrhizae. And one way in which we could do this is actually to pre-treat tree seedlings before they enter the ecosystem, so that they have the right fungi on them from the start to facilitate their early establishment. And this will give them the competitive advantage they need, because they are making these associations that they otherwise probably would have much earlier on. So instead of having a couple of years where they're building this up and fighting with other organisms that have different needs, or more, they've evolved for more rapid establishment under these circumstances. And the approach here is that our company, or the company that I'm hired under, Microtech, has a potential for, and actually has actively been inoculating seedlings for some time, for decades now, and planting them in different parts of Canada, different parts of Ontario, Canada, and as well actually internationally in South America. Next slide, please. And so we're looking to establish or follow up on trials that were originally implanted in Ontario approximately 20 to 25 years ago. Now, these were put in and evaluated. There's a large number of trials. And early data showed there was actually some substantial improvements in survival and growth rates for seedlings that had been inoculated with this microbial mycorrhizal inoculum compared to those that didn't. 10 to 20% was typical, sometimes much higher, sometimes lower, depending on different conditions. And as, again, you were all probably well aware, and as the last presentation highlighted, there's a large amount of variability in these environments. And we can't just necessarily assume they're all going to respond the same to this. So while these early trials are very promising and have shown that they're worth further investigation, we want to continue to, we want to revisit this in order to be able to see what framework we really need in order to make this work. I should also add that one of the benefits of this is that it's actually generally far cheaper than herbicide application at roughly $45 a hectare. So let's go to the next slide, please. The consequences of this is, if this approach is effective at reducing herbicides, or rather improving survival, this may mitigate the need for much of the continued application of herbicides that we are utilizing in some of these areas. And then it has a wonderful potential side benefit of increased ecological benefits. So, you know, on the face of it, if we're growing trees more robustly and more quickly, we're putting more carbon on and into the ground. And I know this is extremely oversimplified, and this is a much bigger picture perspective. But from that perspective alone, that is a very, very important thing in this day and age when we're considering the impacts of human activities on climate change and carbon release into the atmosphere. The more our forests can robustly store carbon in different ways, it's a good overall proxy for a healthy, robust ecosystem. And one element of this is that we're not really clear on the full extent to how this may influence things below ground. And we have good reason to think that this may actually have some positive benefits to increasing carbon storage below ground as well. So that is something that we need to continue to explore. And below ground carbon means, generally speaking, more organic material soils tends to increase the overall, improve the structure, health, and biological resilience and robustness of soils. Next slide, please. So we are now following up on these original trials, and we're reassessing these original trials that took place 20, 25 years ago. And so we are now looking with a bit of a different lens. We're not focused just on will these survive and will these grow more overall, but rather what we want seek to do is to link this to the ecosite framework that Chapman et al. Have developed here. And utilizing that, we have good reason to believe that this inoculation will have a much more important impacts on sites that are already much more stressed. And some of the earlier data showed that more competitive sites and more stressed sites might respond better to it as well. But we need to follow that up into the longer term perspective. And what we're going to be doing is revisiting sites, linking these at the finest level of detail we can using LiDAR and other tools and maps of ecosites in order to try to tease out how and where these are this application is having the most benefits, so that we can target application in areas that need it the most, and so we can balance a mix of application with need and cost. Next slide, please. And I should also add that not only are we doing these retrospectives, but we're actually actively developing new trials where we're going to test. Once we've teased out those relationships by reinvestigating these previous trials, we are going to take that data and then build entirely new trials where we're going to test this in a different and robust framework that is designed not just for assessing seedling survival, but also for assessing how this relates to the bigger picture of ecosite survival. And a lot of it will also then focus on looking at below ground processes. We're really going to be focused on roots. We're going to be focused on soil carbon nutrient exchanges. And we're hoping, we'll see how this plays out, to also look at the genomic components of the soil and how this may be actually altering the communities and how that compares to forests that aren't necessarily, have not been receiving herbicide applications. And so we can have a better idea of how using this product in place of herbicides may bring the forests into a more complex community, more diverse community. And for me, that is something, I'm a scientist who's been aware of mycorrhizae and looked at soils for most of my career so far. And I have to admit, it's something that I've not really thought about the bigger, broader sense of how these things come together. And the more I've been reading on the research that has been done and the perspectives of people who have seen this firsthand, regardless if they've had the scientific, been involved in scientific research or not, that there's this sort of mature ecosystem perspective that can provide enhanced resilience for that environment, and particularly at a soil level. And again, I want to go back to saying I'm relatively new to this program. I'm new to I've done some work in Ontario, but I come from a scientific framework, and I'm beginning to realize the extent to which this is likely inhibiting the way I'm looking at a lot of these problems. And I'm actively looking and interested in meeting and talking with many of you, all of you if possible, about how you see this approach and what you think this may, what needs you may have and how you would like to see that addressed. So at some point, I hope to meet with many of you and have discussions about this, because we want to reframe this perspective and how we are approaching this problem, the same way that all of us are under this HAP 2.0 program. Next slide. And so on that note, we have, as I mentioned, this is one of the most fun things so far about this has been the great number of people I've had the opportunity to get to meet and work with, and that includes Microtech, of course, incorporated in Timmins, who have been plugging away at this project for some time, Wakatoan, David Flood, Isabel, Elena, etc., who have been gracious to really get involved in this and have been pushing to get boots on the ground on this project right away, so that we're all very excited to get this going. Chris McDonald, Jennifer Tallman, Green First and ACOM, who are helping us with site histories and locations, and of course Dave Morris with the extremely long acronym, which I can't remember off the top of my head, for Ministry of Natural and Northern Development Mines, Natural Resources, Forestry, and the Canadian Wood Fiber Center with Nelson Tifo. And we're all excited to hear what you think about this and what you would like to see represented in this. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. It's a very interesting project. Are there any questions for Jason? I think maybe I saw Wayne unmute.
Yep. I'm going to correct you on one issue and then suggest a few things for your trial in the future. But Jason, it was good to see your presentation, and good to hear you're coming back to the Sioux in a couple of days. So we'll get together and we'll definitely have a chance to talk. But on the front about nutrient loss and erosion with the use of herbicides, there's only really one study that I'm aware of that ever did that, and that was the Hubbard Brook on for relatively steep slopes, and they had sprayed 3 to 5 times annually, and then after the third application of herbicide in a row, they at high rates they managed to get some nutrients to leach out of the site. Erosion didn't really start till about year 5, so we're not doing any of that in Ontario, so I don't really see the applicability of that in a discussion at this table. Okay. On the other hand, from all the work I've done with vegetation management and the thousands of seedlings that I've monitored over time, we do know that we have a couple resources: the light, the water, the nutrients, and this will really help with the water and the nutrient side of it. But we still need light for these seedlings to live and to grow. And we know for almost all the species, so work we've done with Bob White and Madev Sharma and others using the VMAP data, that there's a threshold of light that is required for those seedlings to survive, and then another threshold by which they need light in order to grow, and another threshold to grow vigorously. So the simply putting inoculum onto a seedling will help with the water nutrient part, but it'll do little for the light, controlling the light. So that part, you may want to have experiments that look at different light gradients to see where it's effective and where it fails. Because I suspect under heavy raspberry or heavy aspen cover, it'll probably fail. Okay, but other where you're down below 30% cover, probably should work. Yeah, so it should be good. Anyways, good presentation, and we'll have lots of chance to talk when you get up here. Okay, thanks.
Sounds good. Yeah, I don't mean to, I'm not trying to ignore a great deal of the efforts that have been put in by a lot of people looking at these things in advance, and I make no claims to expertise in these areas so far. I'm still early foray into this. I'm working off some of the materials that I've been reading, and merely bring this up as potential concerns that that have been raised, and looking forward to introducing microbial or mycorrhizal inoculum not strictly as an alternative for herbicide, but rather as an entirely standalone way in which to potentially improve competitiveness and productivity on the landscape.
Yeah, you'll need to incorporate it with other techniques in order for it to be effective. Anyways, good presentation. Thanks. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you, Wayne. David? So you got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, there's two prongs to this conversation. It's the science of the mycorrhizae and what it does or doesn't do, or what it can and can't do. But there's the other commercialization part of it around forest carbon management that we're also exploring, which is its persistence. That's why we're doing the 20-year measurements and doing the carbon modeling and looking at commercializing it in a way that we look to inoculate, in this case, a pilot over 5 years, 50 million seedlings, and creating a carbon sequestration pool to sell into the markets. And it was actually through Sustainable Development Technology Canada, where they actually specifically asked the question, could this serve as a herbicide alternative? And they made a co-investment into not only the commercialization question, but the herbicide alternative question. So there's some pretty high level heady people up at the federal level, around climate change and climate action that's quite interested in understanding the applicability of this on the ground. But isn't it interesting? It still takes boots on the ground. It still takes guardians to be out in the forest engaging this. Mycorrhizae is in the spirit of what Wakatoan's name is, about kinship and interconnectedness. Isn't that what a mycorrhizae is? It's a form of that translocation of nutrients and materials and building a healthy subsoil, subforest floor community for the benefit of a broader ecosystem. So anyway, we're proud to be co-partners with Microtech in exploring all of these aspects and continuing to take advantage of HAP 2.0 and the consortium that we have around us here, and I can only see it growing stronger from here. Which
Thanks, David. I do see that Rob raised his hand, but we are starting to run out of time, and I wanted to acknowledge Lynn's question in the chat. She's asking whether there have been any operational plantings using this approach or only trials to date.
So I would offer, we call them large landscape trials, but essentially operational plantations, like hundreds of hectares. Yeah. So we're going back to do the remeasurement on those 20-year-old plots.
Okay. Gordon, are you responding to Lynn's question?
No, I was going to ask another one if that's okay.
Okay, well, I don't want to miss Rob.
Oh, is that right? Sorry.
All right.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Rob.
A quick question, actually, it's a comment. I just like to say, Jason, I really like your guys' approach. I like the idea that you're combining long-term growth and then looking at some new possibilities and putting the whole thing within an ecological framework so that it all fits together. So bravo for you guys.
Go ahead, Gordon.
Okay, so Jason, I mean, for herbicide alternatives, I'm just wondering if you're going to test this Simard, Suzanne Simard's ideas about the mother tree, so what she calls the mother tree. I mean, I could see this in white pine shelter woods for sure, is if the white pine seedlings can tap into, if this indeed this mycorrhizal network idea works, if it taps into the mycorrhizal network and therefore maintains the seedlings so that they are able to survive and grow, that because we do apply herbicides in white pine shelterwoods right now. If that kind of idea would work, or the late winter moose habitat areas that Elena's studying, whether there's a mycorrhizal network extending out from these mature clumps, and whether you could test whether that network idea actually would help, and then as part of a herbicide reduction.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I don't think we've quite got there yet in terms of how we're planning out the new trials, but that is definitely something to consider. We have limited amount of white pine in the area of undertaking, so I'm not sure how developed we're going to be able to pursue that. But going forward, that might be something we might want to hone in on. And I just wanted to address what David said. David, thank you. You really phrased that extremely well in a way that I wish I had affected while I was giving my presentation. I do really like the mirroring of the concepts of nurturing communities below to nurture communities above with this project. And I think that's an important sort of perspective in this approach.
So the second part of our mini symposium today will be a conversation with our panelists, moderated by Guy Smith. Guy is a science program advisor with the Canadian Wood Fiber Centre of Natural Resources Canada, and he's joining us today from Sault Ste. Marie. Guy will be hosting the talk show segment of our mini symposium today. So I will hand it over to him whenever he's ready.
I'm ready. Thank you, Elena. And I'm coming from the territories of the Central Anishinaabe Ojibwe people. I'm delighted to be part of this event, and I want to acknowledge the exceptional moderating by Elena. You've done a fantastic job in helping maintain a flow as we've heard these 5 compelling stories. And I want to thank the 43 participants who've taken time from their days to join in this sharing of what we've done, where we've been, the relationships we've built. So I'm really excited to now be able to carry this forward as we talk about change. And really, we've been talking about change all afternoon. How do we respond to the change? What are we doing and why? And I'm pleased and honored to have a panel comprising David Flood, General Manager of Wakatoan Development Group, Inc., and Chris McDonald, Chief Forester for Ontario with Green First Forest Products, Amberly Kwakajizik, Guardians Program Coordinator, also with Wakatoan, and Elena. As we know, Elena, our moderator, an MSc candidate, U of Guelph, and also with Wakatoan. So I want to start off with David, and David, it was really something the way you described the mycorrhizal network below ground as it relates to communities above ground. So you're a guy who deals in change. It's what you breathe. You're anticipating, you're thinking, you're building opportunities. I mean, that's part of being a general manager with social enterprise. So David, just give us a perspective here on like a big change that's driving what we're doing and how we're doing it. And let's just start this conversation about change with you.
Well, Ani, bonjour everyone watching. Again, as Guy said, welcome those that have taken the time out of their day for this relatively long but mini symposium. It's a pleasure seeing folks and keeping those relationships alive. I'm from Ojibwe First Nation. I was raised out west, but not in my community. I don't speak the Ojibwe language. These are all aspirations of mine to be able to do and rekindle my cultural journey. But as a person, I guess maybe with the gift of always wanting to be out in the forest and on the land, and as a harvester and a provider for my family, I mean, I took up the path of going to both college and university in the study of forestry and forest management. And along that journey, you know, I was sparked to become an advocate for Indigenous participation and raising that awareness of the unfinished business of the coexistence path that we're supposed to be on. So I always think about my day-to-day life and my day-to-day work and the privilege that I've been given to work with these three First Nations that own Wakatoan development and actually bring about and implement the change that they are seeking. I mean, it's very much in line with the practitioner that I am. And what I believe fundamentally is the code of ethics of the RPF. I mean, I wouldn't be a member of the association if I didn't feel the profession had their heart and mind and their ethics in the right space, which is to manage the natural environment for the benefit of the people. And so I'll speak from a geopolitical context about the people. And you know, the reality is, right from contact to making of treaties to today, our communities are growing out of oppression and genocide, while we're trying to compete with the latest and greatest and newest technologies and be at the forefront of change. And the big changes coming at us is climate change and the need to move forward with conservation planning. So some folks might be aware of the international targets of Aichi targets. Some people might be aware of the carbon targets that the federal government has ascribed us to reduce emissions, target emissions to 2050 or by 2050 to like 2020 levels or something like that to stop the two degree shift. Indigenous communities are not only should be key actors in that, but they are the key peoples who are going to be impacted. We are still forest dependent and forest dwelling people across Canada with over 600 communities, 80% of those, you know, being in forest conditions. And so my job, you know, as a change person is really about standing on the ground, just like Wakatoan's logo is, standing on the ground in that interrelationship with everything that's between the ground and the sky, the atmosphere, if you will, and reach a little farther and talk about the spirit world. We're all connected, Wakatoan, kinship. And so in that conversation, in that interrelationship thinking, you know, we want to be part of the forest carbon management. We want to lead conservation planning so that we don't have to continue to deal with species at risk and moose recovery. We want to get rid of herbicide spraying because we don't think that's going to be a solution going forward to deal with climate action and climate change. We're doing more harm than good. Those are fundamentally the views of the communities, and you know, science might other science and research might argue against these things. But we've tried it one way for 100 years. I think it's time to maybe shift things a little bit and try and do it from an Indigenous lens for a while. And that's actually what I really enjoy about this. We have so many young Indigenous practitioners coming forward and being inspired to take up these professions. And our ancestors knew that would happen. That's why access to education was a key treaty element. Knowing that if we were going to coexist as people, then we needed to have that space to do this work together. And I just want to end on this note. The only reason why we fight so hard with Section 92, little brother, the province, is because the feds under the Confederacy gave them the use rights of the resources. What the province needs to do, little brother, is back up a step and realize the courts have ruled they must act as honorably as if they're the federal government in that relationship. And really think about what coexistence with Indigenous people needs to look like. And at the end of the day, that would allow the registered professional foresters to view the people as including Aboriginal people, not just the Section 92 rights holders, where the sawmills are, where the pulp mills are, that service the economy of these non-Indigenous communities for the last 100 years. So we're at a time of change. We're at a pivot point, and you know, so proud of the volume of youth that are coming through and trying to bring their gifts forward as it relates to the land and natural environment. I mean, you got to understand, we were told we didn't have a voice in land and natural environment. We were told stay on the reserves, right? Go to residential school, and then try and be absorbed into the body politic if you survived. So welcome to the world of my mind. And the spirit of change and the needed change that we're all involved in.
Yeah, the spirit of change indeed. And, you know, there is so much wrapped up in what you've said. I mean, I really take away what you said at the beginning. It's really about the people. And you touched on visions of elders and then the aspirations of younger people and the opportunity for young people to find a footing and a pathway through education and through careers. Could you just give us a bit of your take on what this change might mean to this coming generation of practitioners who stand to put that change and respond to it?
I mentioned a little bit about my own evolution and my own cultural and spiritual journey. I'm actually finding a lot more of the youth that are going on to post-secondary education are more and more they're entering into the education field a little more grounded in culture. But I find there's like this sort of 50-50. You know, there's 50% of them that are maybe not so well grounded in culture, but are on that journey, and others have it. So I guess what I'm getting at is the voice that gets created there. If the receiving environment, whether it's industry, government, or just the Indigenous community at large, would be patient with those emerging Indigenous practitioners to allow them to find their footing.
Yeah, that would be something. I'm taken back to the opening words that Chris shared with us, in which he mentioned the notable increase in Indigenous practitioners, people working on vegetation surveys, for example, people in the lands and resource departments of communities increasingly turning or participating in responding to needs in forest management. Chris, I'd just like to bring you into this conversation. Listening to what David has shared, what are the changes that you're picking up on, and how do you see us responding to those changes at this time?
Well, there's changes occurring at a variety of different levels. You're seeing, and right around Chapleau is one example, the relinquishment of a forest license that's been in the hands of one company for many years is now shared by Indigenous communities, companies, municipalities, the Missinaba Forest. In one of the pictures that was in the presentations there, or at least a picture that was taken during some of the field visits, there were perhaps 7 or 8 Indigenous practitioners in that slide, and there's multiple more that are joining organizations in school, are practicing today, that are seeking to be more involved in forestry. So there's a growing level of involvement and engagement, and the growth of lands and resources departments. This, for me, to make it a little bit personal, is a great source of satisfaction. I've had the opportunity in my career to work in several provinces and across the country, and when lands and resources departments for First Nation communities are equipped with similar tools and expertise and resources as forest managers, it's to the benefit of all. It helps all of us think longer term as opposed to shorter term. And some of the practices, some of these matters, like whether it be climate change or forest carbon or herbicide use, they have their roots, some decades in the past. And so we have to unravel and recreate and reestablish a new framework. So the more equipped that land managers, and I use that term comprehensively, land managers within the provincial government, within First Nation communities, within forest companies, if they're playing a role, the more that we are jointly equipped to work together and problem solve and develop new approaches, the better. And I'm very optimistic about not only the growth in Indigenous practitioners, but also frankly, in the non-Indigenous community, and I see it in myself, the attitude, our ability to listen, to learn, and the other thing I'll speak about in turn, I've benefited tremendously from the wisdom of elders who have been patient enough and taken the time to describe the journey that they've faced, whether it be land management or in education, in all walks of life that were unfamiliar to me as someone who grew up in a different and privileged context. So attitudes and approaches, willingness to listen and to adapt, to think longer term, to recognize the value of diversity. In other words, there aren't that many of us, in a global context that care as much as those of us on this call and others about this part of Ontario. We have to work together, right? We had so that was one of the ambitions of expanding and continuing to expand. There's a lot of expertise and it's within the collective capacity of all the participants to move forward in a good way.
David, anything there that you'd like to add to or amplify from what you've just heard?
No, it's perfectly in line with, it's a journey. And just to the key point about communities and lands and resource departments, I've echoed for the last 2 decades that every community needs at least 3 people in a department to be functioning to address the issues of consultation. I mean, consultation and free, prior, and informed consent is one of the biggest drivers that is allowing for the voice of communities to come forward and steer and navigate, large projects and forestry and forest management, hydroelectric, and then getting on with, species at risk, ecosystem management, and climate change. So sometimes Supreme Court decisions matter. Sometimes the seriousness of what UNDRIP actually means should matter. I mean, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People that was done in Canada says it all. We didn't need UNDRIP to tell us. We already had a working framework to move forward with. So here we are, you know, in an environment in this province that wants to double the wood consumption in its provincial forest sector strategy, introducing a new biomass action plan to deal with wood waste. Meanwhile, it hasn't met its international Aichi targets. And where are we going with carbon emission reductions in 2050 with a hostile provincial government that takes the federal government to court? The very first week it was in power, it took the federal framework to court. And in the same vein, over the last 4 years, it tore apart the environmental assessment regulation in the province of Ontario, and now makes EAs discretionary at the cabinet level. That's pretty challenging.
Yes, and it's you mentioned it earlier, David. I mean, it's the people who live on the land, who've grown up on the land, but those people being very much impacted by changes that are coming.
That's right.
I've heard the term empowerment. I think you might have both used it just in the past conversation, and I certainly heard it earlier. To just continue this conversation, I would like to bring Amberly into this panel. Amberly, you gave a great story about the Guardians, and I got the understanding that there was a strong desire on their part to feel that they could be empowered. Could you just speak a little more to what that means to you?
Yeah, sure. Well, personally, I started with Wakatoan in 2018 in the beginning, and I was kind of the only Guardian at the time. And so I got to watch as it grew over time, and so did I. I mean, with my own confidence and wanting to pursue my culture and just becoming more connected to the land and wanting to be out there and know what's going on and have some sort of say. And so from that experience, I feel like I was seeing that happening again with the other youth out there. And yeah, there was just so much that we did. There were a lot of skills that were built. We exposed them to a lot of different professionals and experts and elders and land users, and it was a good mix, and I think everybody had something to offer. And yeah, there were some youth that actually were starting to talk about careers in this field and wanting to be a part of it, so that's huge. And then we had some students wanting to pursue school after, and like all the different people in Wakatoan have things to offer too. We do the training in-house a lot, and we're able to build those relationships and have a space where they're comfortable to ask questions. So yeah, I think the whole experience adds to that empowerment.
And it's inspiring, but it's also a bit daunting when we hear David and Chris talk about certainly the opportunities, but some of the big challenges, you know, like the climate change and the impact that's having, forest industry and you know, use of the resource, the bioeconomy. There's a lot of dynamics. There's factors that are affecting what's going on in the forest and how people are impacted by that. How do you think Guardians are seeing the kind of changes in the world? Where do they sort of position themselves relative to these big changes?
Well, I think too, like when we were working with our climate group, we learned that like they're really thinking about their own future and the future of the land and their kids and grandkids, because that's essentially what we're talking about, the health of the land in the future. And it's just, I think everything's online and trending, and there's videos and a lot of knowledge out there that's a little more accessible than it used to be. And we're seeing a lot of interesting people coming out of the works with like celebrities who are bringing culture revitalization, and they're also empowering the youth, and they're more like within reach, I find too. So we're globally more connected, even though in a sense we're kind of disconnected from the land. But I think a lot of people want to get back to that connection and just knowing where your food comes from. And you like food security and food sovereignty are things we're trying to really bring into the program as well. And that has a lot to do with the health of the forests again and the habitats. So I think the knowledge is just a lot more relevant. and they're into it. I think.
So many connections to make. And then there's the technology side. I mean, there's these different knowledge systems, but we've heard today about remote sensing and soil mapping. And we've even heard about historic studies that are starting to offer new insights. Elena, you knew eventually I would turn to you. And you gave a great presentation about ways of bringing research findings into forest planning. Just looking at this theme of change that's upon us and the challenges, where do you see the technology and science coming into this?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. It's when you think about how Indigenous knowledge has been used in scientific research in the past, there has sort of been a trend of incorporating what's been referred to as TEK, or traditional ecological knowledge, that's been around for a while. And I was just reflecting on the fact that I do remember learning about that and discussing that when I was doing my bachelor's of science, of examples of incorporating TEK into research, but I never actually heard about using Indigenous methodologies in research. And so I think that's one way that we're seeing change more recently, is not necessarily taking Indigenous knowledge and putting it into a scientific framework, or taking Indigenous knowledge and validating it using Western science or Western technology, which has been done before, but finding a way to weave the two systems in sort of like a third space that encompasses both of them. So the question of incorporating technology is really interesting. I know that that's something that we are striving to do with our Guardian program. Is we do have a drone, we have tablets, so we're trying to get the youth trained in that way of doing things as well. And then for my project, I do hope to be able to use LiDAR in my research, trying to better model or map late winter moose areas, because it gives us that more detailed image of what the forest actually looks like. And one way that we're hoping to do that is using this 3D mapping technology that Wakatoan has acquired. The name of the company is Lamazoo, and they can take really complex data sets like LiDAR and turn it into this 3D sort of virtual reality of the forest that you can walk around in, and even you can use virtual reality headsets with. So I think that that's a really cool example of a way that you can use technology to make incorporating Indigenous knowledge or gathering Indigenous knowledge easier, because it's a more relatable way, I think, of having conversations with people about the forest without having to go out on the forest, which is ideal. But in situations where you're limited in time or resources, or you're talking to people who maybe can't physically go out, being able to create a virtual reality where you can sort of make things land-based while still being like at a computer is a really cool way that technology and Indigenous knowledge can work together.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Some really interesting examples, and to consider how technology, when applied and used smartly, can actually enable enrichment by drawing in Indigenous perspectives and Indigenous knowledge. I'm just looking to the four of you. We're talking about science and technology as it's coming into play in this dynamic of change that we're part of. Any thoughts that any of you'd like to add, building on this S&T theme right now?
Well, I would offer, again, Wakatoan is trying to leave no stone unturned and trying to advance itself, as Elena's done by sharing the Lamazoo product that we're taking the time to explore. To really help us at the landscape level. But we're also in a multi-year, through SINFR, a transfer payment agreement to work on and collaborate with extension service work around large landscape modeling, trying to make sure that our communities understand what that interface looks like, to close the knowledge gap, as opposed to the fight to trump each other's experts, so to speak, but to try and do this in a way that creates a conversation that we will be able to run real time together in a more effective manner. And what I'm really alluding to is, geopolitically, when 49 chiefs in Nan territory get together, to speak about with the province, what does the future of 2/3 of Northern Ontario get to look like 100 years from now? We've really got to accelerate that fluency of how we're going to communicate together. The world demand for wood consumption is going up 4 times in this decade. There are just so many globalized impacts that are coming at us, and we don't have another decade. We've got approved forest management plans around us right now that we're involved in implementing, to try and, cultivate what the next 10 years might look like beyond this. So that's the anxiety or the gap that I feel needs to be filled, is we need to build that fluency together. And it includes academia, it includes research, it includes industry. We all got to flip the page together here, which I know I've operated in the past, other national level conferences on forestry, landscapes, ecosystems, and environment. We say that we're not all on the same page. We seem to all be pointing our arrows in slightly different directions, but not the same way. So there needs to be a harmonization, and I think technology is the fastest way that we're going to see ourselves close the adaptation gap for our communities.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I'm thinking of what Chris was saying earlier, and Chris, I think your comments were a bit more specific to the region in which you work, with Green First in Superior Northeast. But this idea of gaining fluency and understanding, bringing together different voices and directing them, well, co-developing, I guess. So maybe we could just look at that kind of language connecting fluency, if you will, that we've witnessed through the sharing in HAP. How do we see this helping us, or where do we see this taking us in the coming years? And Chris, I'm directing my question at you right now, and I see there is time. I'm interested in any among our 43 participants. If you have some thoughts or ideas that you'd like to interject, please put them in the chat or put a hand up, and we'll see if we can open this panel a little wider. But Chris, to you right now.
So to David's point about forest management plans exist, it's not too early to be thinking about the next forest management plans. And in fact, in talking about an ecological framework, as we heard earlier today, this term LIDAR, which is a new tool for forest inventory, is being developed for Ontario forests as we speak. The integration that David talked about, HE targets, about I'll call that conservation lands of there's various ways that lands are described. There's for non-forestry or for conservation purposes. How do those fit? So while we all at a certain point must focus on some of the procedural aspects of planning, we need to maintain space to not just entirely focus on the plans that we're in today. And so in other words, to prepare, to develop the common language around the sorts of tools to evaluate alternatives and options on the landscape, whether it be for moose management, for various species over time. So this engagement, this collaboration is very helpful in that regard, because you see the diversity of participants that are joining with us in that.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for sharing that. And just trying to keep an eye on any hands up. What I'd like to do as we approach the conclusion is I'd like each of you to think a bit about your wish. I mean, what is your one wish for what you'd love to see happen as we move forward in our relationship that we've built together through HAP? Looking ahead to the next 3 to 5 years. So just before I turn that question to you, I'm just looking quickly for comments. Any hands up from our participants out there before we move to that? What's your wish for the future? And I'm just trying to keep my beloved cat at bay. He seems to want to contribute now. Well,
if I can offer, Guy,
yeah.
I'll just share just a little. We, you know, we've come this far and put enough energy into this that I don't think we're gonna break the relationship and separate. I don't think we're gonna see ourselves dilute and walk away from each other. I think if anything, this has strengthened the commitment and raised the awareness and is exhibiting an example of a vehicle at the right sort of scale on the landscape to really try and interact with each other to make change. And I mean, I'll point to Amberly as she's building out the 13 Moon program, but looking at the Guardian season for the 4 months with the post-secondary students and then the 2 months of the intensive high school engagement that we're going to do. I mean, she's pretty much down to the hour, let alone what are we going to do that week? There is no shortage now of downloading, you know, engagement with our seasonal youth, Indigenous youth, and they're coming out of the woodwork. Like, we're hiring seasonal youth that are graduating and coming out of environmental tech, natural resource tech, and you know, that's amazing. Like,
that's wonderful to see that. And I love the way you talk about sort of scale on the landscape, getting that, you know, where it's sort of a scale where things can really happen. Amberly, what are your thoughts there? A bit of a wish or an aspiration looking ahead?
I think I think we want to like reach as many youth as we can, and really like be there for them and help them like get to where they want to be, and just make sure that like whether or not the experience that they come out with us shows them something they love, even learning something you don't like is also important. And last year we had students interested in nursing, students interested in carpentry, and just a variety. And then they all came out, you know, thinking twice about, maybe I want to be involved in the land. Maybe I want to work out there every day. Maybe that's my thing. And I just think that us being able to provide that opportunity is just huge, because co-ops can be pretty limiting. The high school experience, especially in Chapleau, didn't expose me to this industry. So yeah, I think we're just bringing something to this area that it doesn't really have. And I just want us to be able to, have a good impact.
Yeah, no, I think being that avenue to feed that desire is so important. Elena, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think sort of similar to what Amberly was saying, one of the things I'm really excited to do this summer is go up to Chapleau and put on a little bit of a workshop with our guardians to talk about my research, but also generally about using Indigenous knowledge and research and using Indigenous methodologies for research, because I really did not know anything about it until I started this master's program. And that was kind of surprising to me, because I've been working with an Indigenous organization for about a year, and I've educated in environmental sciences, but it just was something that wasn't accessible to me, I think because there's sort of this line drawn between hard sciences and natural sciences and like the soft sciences or the like social sciences side of things. So I definitely want to youth to be more aware of that option of like, you can pursue research from that Indigenous perspective. You can use both knowledge systems in research, but I also, and this is something that I guess we don't necessarily have much of a say in, but I would like to see more of those things that I guess tend to be labeled as more like sociology or anthropology be taught to students in natural science fields, so that they have that ability to sort of navigate different cultural ways of doing things and ways of knowing.
Awesome. Yeah, we're getting close to closure here. So I'm interested in getting Chris's aspiration for the future. And then I believe on the program, we're going to have our closure, and I believe we'll be bringing you back to Elena. Wow, this time has flown, and I know there may be some other input or questions out there. Please use the chat, and thank you so much for this panel opportunity. So,
Guy, just
yeah.
Wayne does have his hand up. If we can squeeze him in, he's patiently got his hand up, and I will answer the question in the chat.
Sure. Okay, go ahead, Wayne.
Okay, I think the one thing I would put in, hopefully will improve in the future, is having projects that are being proposed submitted through a peer review prior to the moving forward. I mean, guys like me end up seeing the projects when it comes back through as a journal paper, and my rejection rate because of the scientific methodologies or Western science that has been applied may not be that great. So it'd probably be a worthwhile if projects like Alina's putting forward. I mean, guys like me worked on moose corridors with buffers in 1987. We did more work on the falling snow ecosystem project. We did a full scale analysis of buffer zones for the Tembec during the FRP days. So there's a wealth of information out there to help individuals that are new working on these topics to get that vetted through some of the veterans that are around, and help them improve those their designs before they become a journal paper, and we're sitting there reading it, deciding whether to accept or reject. Right, that's too late in the game. Okay, thanks.
Well, thanks, Wayne. It's great to have you as one of the veterans among us. Chris, aspirations, thinking ahead?
I've got some practical aspirations. I want a team of electronic battery operated brush saws out in the woods. This summer and beyond. There's certainly an opportunity for that. I'm really focused on the practitioners in the woods who are faced with renewing forests and want to do the right thing, live in the communities, and how do we bring more tools to them to help with continued aggressive reduction in herbicide use. And so that's a clear focus, and I see this collaboration being very helpful in that end, and I'm looking forward to so that's at the operational scale. I'm looking forward to the ecological framework providing the pre-harvest tools, the ability to think at a land-based level on these topics well in advance of forestry, so that we can design and manage in the absence of herbicides to the greatest extent possible.
Yeah, I love how you share the operational scale and the more landscape, and we've heard that today too, the importance of the landscape, but also getting the scale right in how we collaborate and work together. Look, thanks to the panel for your insights, your perspectives, and again, I've learned a great deal from each of you, so I really appreciate your time with us today, and I am going to turn things over to Elena, who I believe is going to carry us through to closure here.
Thank you, Guy. David, did you want to answer the question in the chat quickly?
Yeah, it just doesn't, this one long. I don't support hiring more Indigenous advisors in governments. I think what the government should be doing is spending more of that investment into communities, so that the voice from the First Nations become more balanced and stronger, and there's more parity. I would still argue today, for every one Ministry of Natural Resource person that I speak to, in my role, in my position, there's 30 people behind that person supporting them. That's administration, that's other managers, that's other co-workers, other research departments. Like, it's not, I'm not just talking to one person here. So if we want to co-create change, co-develop change, we've got to raise that bar of parity. And I think the only way to do that is stop adding advisors into provincial and federal governments, and let's trust that we can jointly build a better operating environment going forward that includes economy, that includes ecosystems and well-being. Thank
you much, David. So I think I'll just quickly wrap up by saying I think there was definitely a big theme today in the symposium of change from a lot of different angles. I think just about all of the stories we heard are some pretty cutting edge things, from guardian programs, which are relatively new in Canada, to using new alternatives like the mycorrhizal inoculation. So it's an exciting time to be involved in this industry. So I will wrap up by saying thank you to everyone, Chimigwech, for joining us. We're almost at 4 now. I want to say thank you for the turnout. I was really impressed, and also very impressed that we retained close to 40 people for just about the whole time, which means that we were doing something right. So thank you for sitting in with us for so long. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. And we will definitely follow up on some of the questions in the chat and share some links to people who requested them. And yeah, feel free to reach out if you have any questions or any follow-up, and enjoy the rest of your day.
you much, everyone. Take care.